Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Kinophile, and today I'd like to talk about some arguments against bestiality. These have been broached by one John Baldari. I'll give a link to both a video of his and a paper that he wrote, which he's essentially reading from in the video, so that you have some idea what these arguments are without me having to summarize them too much. I will, of course, summarize them, but if you want to know for yourself what the arguments are, they will be available for you. So, essentially, what Mr. Baldari attempts to argue here is that bestiality is a socially unacceptable practice and is morally wrong. Fine, so long as he has good arguments, I see no reason why you can't argue that, although I seriously disagree with the arguments he does make. He argues based on 5 standard premises, according to him, although I would consider them more arguments than premises in and of themselves. And even then, they're not exactly separate. The premises are instrumentality, consent, disease transmission, deviance, and morality. Now, I would argue that only 2 of these are actual reasons in and of themselves, and the rest are just extra statements padded on to make it seem like there's more reason for bestiality to be wrong than there really is. But we'll go over that as we go into the various different premises, as he calls them. Before we begin, he had a few definitions that he decided to get into, which I have no problem with. So let's go into them before I start talking about his actual content. Instrumentality is the strict concept of usefulness towards some specific end. Not general usefulness, but instead the value of a particular action toward achieving some desirable end goal. That end goal must further have some value in and of itself. And basically, that's fine, but then he decides the goal is going to be the moral identity of humankind, known in philosophy as the good, which is extremely vague and hard to pin down, at least the way he describes it. He doesn't actually define what the good is, he just assumes we know. Alright, moving on to the next definition. Rape is defined as the use of force, whether through physical violence, coercion, or the threat of violence or deception, for sexual gratification. I pretty much agree with that definition. I disagree with what he does with it later in order to paint bestiality as a part of this, but that definition makes sense to me. What other definitions are there? The term beast denotes any non-human animal. It doesn't really say that the animal is somehow lesser than human beings. There's no connotation other than this animal is not human. That's it. Deviance is the sociological phenomenon in which a particular behavior is different from the societal norm. Again, I agree with that, though what he does with that is going to be slightly dishonest. Defining morality is a work in itself, so for my purposes, well, for Baldari's purposes, allow it to mean that intuition, whether instilled by society or inborn, that allows human beings to function well with other human beings in a way that makes them happy and provides for the greater good. Again, a really vague definition, not suited for the purpose here, but it's what we have to work with. So, let's move on to the actual arguments. Argument 1. Instrumentality. Basically, Mr. Baldari argues here that sex with animals serves no purpose that could not be served by other means, such as sex with human beings or masturbation. I would disagree with that. I think that there are various reasons why, if a person is so inclined, sex with animals might in fact be more beneficial overall to both the human and the animal than sexual intercourse with a human being, or than masturbation even. Masturbation may be harmless, but it doesn't really help anybody other than the person actually doing it. but consensual sex between animals, even if the animals aren't of the same species, it's pleasurable to both parties. And so long as the consequences aren't overly far-reaching, so that essentially there is no issue involved with disease transmission or consent or anything else which might have longer-term consequences in the sexual act, if it's pleasurable to both parties and does no harm, I would say that it's actually, in an instrumental fashion, better for the purpose of deriving sexual pleasure for both human and animal than masturbation or sex with human beings for certain people. I'm not saying that everybody should do this. Most people aren't going to. But those who want to, and those who are conscientious about it, I don't see the problem. So next, we get into consent. And Mr. Baldari's argument here is one that I've dealt with before, namely that animals are not rational beings and therefore cannot have fully informed consent to anything. Well, if they absolutely cannot do this, and there's no reason to expect them to do it, then there's no reason why we should have some moral qualms about their not being able to do it, while at the same time using animals for other purposes. Purposes such as food, or clothing, or companionship, or whatever they are. Essentially, if we are going to argue that these other purposes can provide mutually beneficial relationships between human beings and other animals, and I won't go into it here, but I might argue that even raising animals for food does have that effect, essentially, I don't see why having an animal for companionship is instrumental towards the end of, say, emotional well-being toward the animal and the human, but sexual relationships aren't. They don't have to be, and when they aren't, it's immoral. But they can be moral if they are consensual. Mr. Baldari also goes into a gigantic tirade about how rape is awful and it's wrong and it's the worst thing ever. While I disagree with the extent to which he takes it, yes, rape is wrong. Yes, rape is bad. There is no reason why one should force oneself on another being for their own gratification or to feel powerful. Of course that's wrong. But that doesn't mean that all bestiality fits that criterion. Some of it does, maybe a lot of it, but not all. So I don't see why we should call all bestiality immoral when the thing you actually have a problem with is a subset of bestiality. Now, his third argument is from disease transmission, and this one is tenuous at best. He argues that there is a link between human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and another similar virus called simian immunodeficiency virus, SIV. And he cites a paper explaining various theories on the origins of AIDS, but he says that there's a reasonable suspicion that AIDS was introduced to human beings through sexual contact between humans and great apes. First, let's take a look at this. I've read the article in question, and there is no suggestion whatsoever that enough contact was made between human beings and great apes to produce human immunodeficiency virus. In fact, there are 4 theories which are discussed in the paper, and none of them really have to do with anything sexual, except among humans themselves. One is that a polio vaccine in the 1950s and early 1960s was tainted with simian immunodeficiency virus, and this caused it to spread through the center of Africa. Another theory is that some hunter got infected blood into one of his cuts when hunting or butchering a chimpanzee, which caused the chimpanzee version of simian immunodeficiency virus to transmit. And then there are two other theories which are basically modifications of the cut hunter theory. One being that it had to do with contaminated vaccination needles for polio and from other medicines. And the final, most interesting but probably least evident theory is that essentially the rise of HIV in Africa was due to the chaos which followed colonial rule of these Central African nations and the horrible conditions that they were under at the turn of the 20th century. Note how none of this has anything to do with sex, except between human beings. Yes, it's possible that there was sexual contact between human beings and great apes, but it's rather unlikely given that the animals themselves aren't all that well domesticated, and it's really difficult to rape a chimpanzee when it's got so much strength behind it, frankly. So that's it for the issue of disease transmission. While I agree that it's possible, I don't think that the link has been demonstrated well enough to cause bestiality to be immoral, especially considering the fact that with safe sexual practice, with the use of condoms and other contraception, you can remove that disease risk much to the same extent that you can with human beings. And as a result, there's no real reason why this particular behavior should be immoral. Moving on to deviance. Basically, this argument is, it's unpopular, therefore it's wrong. He tries to wiggle out of this by saying that some forms of deviance are a conditioned response and cause no harm, whereas others are horrible. But in the end, this is basically an argument from popularity. And I don't agree with that in a moral framework. It may be a reason to hide it from other people, but it is not at all a reason to suppose that the act in and of itself is immoral. It disturbs some people, yes, but only if they know about it. And finally, Mr. Baldari makes the argument that human beings are the only really moral creatures on this earth, that we have moral capacities which other beings do not have, and one of those common morals is no sex with animals, which again, while common, is not actually immoral. He then goes on to other arguments in favor of zoosexuality and why he thinks they're wrong, but I'm running out of time, so I'll just make this brief. Of his 5 arguments against bestiality, the first is clearly wrong. Sex with animals can be instrumental towards sexual pleasure, and that is a good enough means in and of itself, assuming that all precautions are taken to prevent dire consequences. Consent can easily be given by another species, even though some work needs to be done to determine whether an animal consents or not. No link to disease risk has been established by this article. The fact that this sexual behavior is deviant doesn't make it wrong. And the fact that human beings say that it's wrong also doesn't make it wrong. Essentially, there's only one argument here that I would consider even worthy of response, and that is the instrumentality argument. But I think that sex with animals can be instrumental to sexual pleasure, and so that argument is wrong. So that's it for this video. This is the Erudite Conophile signing off.